All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Aftershow of the Magnus Carlsen Invitational. This is Grandmaster Pascal Charbonneau. I am by myself again today, probably for the last time in a little while. I think we're going to have a bunch of guests in the next several days. We have Anna Rudolph, who I think will be with me tomorrow. If she's not with me for the Aftershow, we'll be doing an event together earlier. And then we'll have also Alex Astana Lopez with us, and probably a few more exciting guests before this tournament wraps up. So hi everyone in the chat too. I see you guys, and I'll be interacting hopefully. Hello, Shock Pirate. So we had an interesting day of chess today. Good matchup, Magnus Carlsen against MVL, one that I think had a lot of promise. Magnus had a pretty dominant performance, so far he seems to be in good shape in this tournament. He might have been in a bit of an angry mood at the start after having lost the final of the Banter Blitz Cup to Faruja. Of course, very different time control. 3 minute versus playing game in 15 minutes plus 10 seconds increment as they play in this tournament. But so of course, I think the longer the time control, maybe the harder he is to beat. But that being said, he has played very well so far, probably the most solid of anyone for sure. And then the other matchup was Faruja, who was trying to get on the scoreboard against Fabiano Caruana. As you can see here on the screen, it did not go well for him. But both matches were interesting. I mean, the first one sort of, I guess the first game set the tone for Faruja in this match, and it was hard to come back after that. He probably should not have lost the first game, and we'll go through it. They actually reach a really fun position at the end that is worth looking at. We had a little bit of everything today in Magnus's last game, where he had basically already clinched a match because he couldn't lose. They had a rook ending that reached a fascinating theoretical position, and we'll go through that. It's actually quite instructive if you've never seen this kind of drawing scheme. So we're going to go through that. I would also point out that in fantasy chess today, I did extremely well, and I'm almost at the top of the standing in the round contest. I'm not sure if I am myself eligible for prizes. I should be, right? Why not? Why not? I can get. I don't think I have any edge, so I should be eligible for prizes. I'm pretty close to the top, so we'll see how people do tomorrow. But I had the right winners today. I have not done well in the past, so this is a first for me. But this is also just a reminder, encouraging everyone to participate. Someone in the chat here, Red Ribbon 3700, is asking: has Faruja just been unlucky, or is he still far away from the super elite? I think so. I think you can't say that he's far away from the super elite. I mean, his rating already in slower games is that of a super elite grandmaster, essentially, right? Like well over 2,700 at this point. And he's only 16 years old. It's normal at that age to have a couple of bad performances. I think it's, when you're younger, you might be a little bit more streaky. I know I used to be more streaky in the sense that, it's maybe you have less experience recovering from losses. And and this time control is also a little bit of a funny time control where no one has too much experience, and that adds a little bit to the difficulty of playing, right? So it's sort of an in between playing blitz and playing slower games, and it's maybe a tough one to adjust to. And there's another audience question here from Zealand Zen. Asking, could I explain why this scoring scheme is used? Why not 1 point per game? So that's a good question. And by the way, this kind of scoring system is not something that's new. But for example, they've gone back and forth in the tournament, which is called the Chess Olympiad, which is one of the major events. Normally happens every 2 years. This year it's been postponed. They've kind of gone back and forth between using a normal scoring system where every single point is just counted as a win. So for example, like a 3-1 score would just be 3-1. It wouldn't be that one side wins, the other side loses. But I think tournaments tend to be more interesting when there's winners and losers in matches. Now, especially in rapid, I think the fact that 2.5 wins and gives all these points makes it just more fun. Now, of course, you could argue the other way. And of course, some people like Faruja, it looks especially cruel because he's done, not that badly. But but anyway, yeah, I mean, there's different ways to do it. I think the way we've done it is sort of a hybrid where, if it's 2-2, then you still get a point even if you lose in a tiebreak. So it's a little bit of a hybrid uh, where, we thought this would make things fun, and I think it has. So, but there's certainly arguments for different scoring systems. Um, all right, so we're gonna go first through the Magnus Carlsen against MVL match, which um, which was interesting. But one thing that is kind of clear is that Magnus felt like he was in control of this match from the first game on. Um, and so in the first game, MVL, who's been playing different openings, now reverts to something that he's of course played, a whole lot, which is the Najdorf. But Magnus immediately surprises him with this weird move, Bishop C4. Now, if you may have never seen this move, I think I've seen it, but I couldn't remember anything about it. Of course, the normal move is Knight C3, then they play A6, and you get into all the theory of the Najdorf defense. Now, this is an odd sort of pseudo pawn sacrifice. It's not necessarily bad to take the pawn on E4, and now I think someone has played this in bullet chess against me before. You can play Bishop F7 and sacrifice the bishop. You get the piece back though. G6, Queen D5. King G7, Queen E4. But I don't think this is what Magnus was going for, because this is not a very good position for White. White immediately kind of gets pushed back. You can play Bishop F5, D5. It's just not a great setup. The king on G7, it's pretty much like you've castled. So I don't love this kind of setup for White. But you can also play, I'm assuming that Magnus may have, on knight takes E4, he may have wanted to play Bishop B5. Now, this has been played in some games too, and it gets kind of crazy. Bishop D7. I meant Queen H5 first. Queen H5, and then you have to defend this pawn. So the only move really is E6, and then you can play Bishop B5. And on Bishop D7, there's knight takes E6, and the position gets kind of crazy. And there's a little bit of theory here, and I don't want to go through all of it because it's a bit nutty. But basically it starts with Queen F6. You're hitting F2. You're hitting the knight, and White can play Knight F4, and it just gets to be a messy position. But I think Black is supposed to be totally okay in this. But if you haven't looked at it for a very long time, then certainly, and you don't really remember, it's definitely all a bit scary. So MVL plays E6. Nothing wrong with that. Magnus castles. And now I do wonder why MVL decided not to take that pawn on E4, because it doesn't look incredibly convincing for White. Again, if he hasn't looked at this in a while, he maybe is just a little bit afraid of Magnus's preparation. But it's not exactly clear what White is planning to do if you just retreat, right? There's some play, but it's not obvious. White is well developed, of course, but it's a center pawn, and it looks okay for Black. I think in a slow game, MVL would probably play this. But so he plays E6, and now Magnus he plays Bishop E7, and Magnus plays Bishop D3. So it's not the most ambitious setup for White, but you got to remember though that what he's trying to do is essentially kind of force Black into a Maroczy bind. Now the funny thing is he plays Knight C6, Knight takes, pawn takes C4. And I looked at a database to see if this position had happened, and sure enough, it's happened a whole lot. But normally in this position, Black is basically up at tempo, right? Normally it's White to move in this position, and then they play Knight C3, and that's what the database shows as every single time this position has happened. So here Magnus is down a tempo, but he's arguing that maybe it doesn't matter too much because it's a fairly close position. It's not one of these positions in a Sicilian where you have where you have a double-edged attack, one side going on the king side, the other side going on the queen side. It's nothing like that. So it's more stable. But it's hard to believe that White has any opening advantage. But Magnus seemingly just wanted to get a game. Probably the most testing is to play D5, right? In the Sicilian, if you can play D5 without, I'm sorry, I'm touching my face, which you're not supposed to do, but I've had allergies, and so I apologize for that. But D5 looks very tempting to play because normally, White has already wasted some time. And so I think here White would probably just play either Knight C3 or Knight D2 and play this position. Maybe Knight D2 is better. so you don't get hit with d4. And I don't know. I struggle to believe that white has any advantage here. But Magnus is kind of okay playing equal position sometimes in the opening, and just think that he thinks he can outplay his opponents. So, but MVL went for this structure with e5, and I don't particularly like this structure for black. And Magnus has had another game, I think, against Fabiano, where he got this kind of position, and I think objectively it's probably close to equal, but it seems much easier for white to play. Like white has basically an easy plan of playing b4 and b5 somewhere, or just play against this pawn structure. And now the rest of this game is actually a sort of typical Magnus grind until he just makes one mistake and lets the win slip away. And again, I find this position to be pretty unpleasant for black. So it goes here. This is fairly basically what you would expect to happen in this kind of structure. And it's MVL basically can't take the pressure and plays d5, which d5 is not a very good move, but it is a tough position. One thing that maybe instead of playing knight f6, maybe he could have tried to play h6. This is kind of a typical plan too. The idea is to play bishop g5. You're trying to trade maybe the best minor piece of white's. I still think this is going to be a somewhat unpleasant position to defend in the long term, but probably exchanging that one minor piece helps a little bit. And one of the problems with black is that on every move you got to contend with white, playing b4 to b5, creating a passed pawn, and so it's not incredibly easy to create counterplay. But I think that exchange might have helped him a little bit. Instead, he played knight f6, h3, d5, which is sort of the logical continuation of knight f6. But this simplification of the position actually hurts him. So pawn takes d5. The rest is forced for a few moves. b5. So what has happened here? So the material has been greatly reduced, but white has a really dangerous passed pawn. And black is a little bit uncoordinated. Like if he could play bishop c5, then he might be okay. But, bishop c5 right away is met with rook c1, and it just loses a piece right away. So then there's the move in the game, which is very logical. And maybe that's what he was counting on. And he might have just missed white's response. Although I don't know. I think even if white were forced to play this is still not such an easy position. But here Magnus makes a very strong move, queen h5. Now, the importance of this move is it's that the bishop now has a very good square. So if he just defends it, or moves his bishop, let's say bishop a8 or queen d7, then you can just play bishop f1. It's a very good square, and now this pawn looks like it's got a free to b6 anyway. Maybe not free to b7, but free to b6, and this is going to be a miserable position to defend for black. I mean, that pawn actually hinders the light squared bishop, so just a really unpleasant position. So he decides to play here. Pawn takes. Whoops, I'm sorry, my arrow. Pawn takes to d3. Pawn takes d3. Queen takes d5. And now again, it's like he's about one move away from being okay, but he just doesn't quite get there. So he plays rook to d8, queen e4. Now the threat is b6. The queen has to defend the bishop. He goes bishop f8, b6, queen c2, and now sorry, my headset. After rook c1, queen b3, Magnus makes an unusual for him mistake. Queen b3 was actually a bit of a blunder. Like queen b2 was a little better, and we'll see why in a second. But after queen b3, Magnus had the one chance to play b7, and normally he sees that kind of stuff very quickly. But in this case, he actually played a little bit too fast, I think, that one move. And the idea is that on d2, this is sort of a very nice finish here. You play bishop takes d2, rook takes d2, rook c8. Now you're threatening to play b8, and there's not really enough. Black doesn't have time to do anything creative here. If rook d1, king h2, there's no bishop d6 because the bishop is pinned. So there's really nothing to do here. Queen b1 doesn't work. You can either queen, or you could of course trade and play b8. That should be winning also. So yeah, I mean, on b7, the threat is rook c8, and there's not really a defense here. I'm sorry, where was I? Was I in the right position? Yeah, so here. Yeah, so b7, Yeah, b7 would just have been winning. So uh, Magnus somehow played queen f3. Oh, and I was going to show that queen b2 would have been an interesting attempt, because now on b7 there's a difference here. Yeah, here d2 uh, is much stronger because we can't take on d2 rook d2 because the rook is attacked. So oh, I'm sorry. This is still winning. Actually, there was something. Oh no, it's queen takes d2. Sorry about that. I knew there was a reason why this worked. So rook takes d2, there would be rook b1, and you can make a queen. But queen takes d2, and now it's not clear, because if he goes rook c8, I mean, it still is worthy of analysis, but it's not clear. Now you have either maybe bishop d6, maybe queen d6, maybe queen d7. There's different, like queen d7 looks unclear. The bishop can still come to d6. So on here, there's bishop d6, tricky move. So anyway, there's it got very complicated, and in this time control they don't have forever, but they actually played very fast. So Magnus played queen f3, a bit of a mistake. d2, rook d1, and now suddenly it's kind of equal, because these pawns basically cancel each other out, and they'll be traded. So here they just made a draw sort of quickly as the pawns got traded. So Magnus definitely in control in that first game, but MVL with the draw with black, the result itself is very satisfactory, and so they get into game two. Now Magnus plays g6, most likely aiming for a Grunfeld, although he has been known to play the King's Indian sometimes. So h4. h4 is one of these moves that people play against a Grunfeld. The main idea is that d5, pawn takes, knight takes, h5, you can argue is a good Grunfeld position for white with the pawn already on h5. So it's sort of a move that aims to force black into playing a King's Indian structure. So, but of course, in the King's Indian, h4 is not necessarily the variation that you want to play with white, right? So that's those are the ups and downs of the move. d6, e4, castles, bishop e2, and this is something that people have played. I think even Magnus has played this with white. It's sort of a hybrid. There's a system called the Averbach system against the King's Indian, where you play bishop e2 and bishop g5. This is with the pawn back on h2. It's sort of similar. It can actually transpose in some variations. Yeah, Magnus himself has played this. Now, pretty much everyone on e5 plays d5, and it leads to sort of complex, like standard King's Indian positions. Some games go like c6, h5, and they're messy. But black is probably okay compared to other King's Indian, but white has a playable position, and certainly a shot at an advantage. But pawn takes e5 is weird, like this exchange variation. So you can have this position with the knight on f3 instead, and the bishop on e2, and instead you have a pawn on h4, and it's hard to believe that a pawn on h4 in the endgame is as useful a move as having the knight on f3. So the rest goes kind of, these are normal moves in this exchange variation that black plays, and it's just hard to believe that this is a good version for white. It's possible here that instead of h takes g6, maybe you might as well try to give a point to this h pawn being here, play bishop h8, and then I guess similar to the game, like rook h4, and maybe that's a better version. I'm not entirely sure, but I thought that taking on g6 is sort of admitting that this has gone nowhere. So after rook h4 here to defend this pawn, knight e6, it's really just a bad version of this exchange variation. The knight's already getting to d4, so it really is just kind of a failed experiment here. Yeah, it is funny that Magnus kind of playing MVL's opening with black, but you got to remember that Magnus is or was anyway a really good Grunfeld player. He did play the Grunfeld also himself, so it's not like he played an opening that he's never played before. He played the Grunfeld almost exclusively with black, or at least a lot with black for years and years. So just a bad position for MVL here. But he does manage to. By the way, in the analysis, Magnus did point out that he had this interesting move, knight g4, with the idea to play knight d4 like this. It gets complicated here, but it's not entirely clear that this is better than what he did. In fact, I think maybe what he did is a little better than this. Um, but after knight d4, he said that he had missed knight takes, pawn takes. He had missed castles long. He had just looked at rook d1. Not that it changes too much. And here, it's possible that he could have tried to play c5, which just anchors the pawn. Doesn't threaten to take a piece yet because the rook is not defended, but now you're threatening to move the rook, right? So because if you move the rook, you're forking two pieces. So in this position, white has to do something. They can't play knight d5 because you will take the bishop if there's a piece interposing here. So he can make a move like bishop g5, and then probably you move the rook, and maybe he's better here. And so I think this was worth trying. He played knight g4, and optically, I mean, this is very tempting to play, so I certainly understand why Magnus played this, because he by force gets this position, which white has a unique pawn structure. Instead of arrows, I should have done just circles here. So this is a unique pawn structure for white, definitely not one that you want to get. That being said, it's going to be a rook ending, and it's, as much as you have squares, it's very hard to win because, you kind of have to give something to get something here. And so black was better. I don't know if he missed a chance. It looked like Magnus played really well this endgame. We're just going to go through the moves real quick here, but he didn't seem to really miss any chance. Like he managed to, it looks like he's making progress, but white, eventually pawns get traded and you just are not able to win. So, MVL had two difficult rook endings in this match, and the next one he did draw the next rook ending. So, all right, let's move on to the next game because I want to show you all the games because there's a lot of good chess today. So, all right, so going to the third game. Now MVL plays the Slav, and this has been his opening in this tournament. He's refusing to play the Grunfeld. And interesting, of course, like this has been talked about a lot by all the commentators. Speculating, is it just that he wants to play the Slav, or he wants to get more comfortable with playing the Slav, or he's got an issue with his Grunfeld since the candidate tournament happened? Of course, none of us really know. So here they get into this sort of big theoretical variation, and it seems like. It seems like MVL fairly well. He plays well up to a point here. This apparently has all been played and analyzed before. Grishuk and Dubov, and Peter Zvidler and Jan Gustafsson, all of our commentators today, seem to have seen this position before. But really, what happened was that in this position, Magnus plays e5. So this is a very interesting strategical. By the way, in most of these positions, like if you're wondering about why he can't take the pawn on h2, it's a good question, but typically it's just that white gets way too much play very quickly. In this specific one, I looked at bishop a5, the queen goes here, and then you just play something like, I guess you take here, and then bishop f3, I think. Is it bishop f3 in this position? I think it was bishop f3 followed by e5, but you also could just play without playing bishop a. I also looked at this first and then bishop f3. Yeah, this actually is maybe clearer because with the bishop on a5, there's other ideas, but here knight c6 is not as good because the bishop is not attacked, and you play e5, and you have more than enough for a pawn. The king doesn't get to safety here. So this is if he takes on h2. So MVL plays knight c6. And Magnus plays e5, which maybe was not the only move, but now MVL just plays too fast and makes probably the worst of the like logical alternatives. The most probably the best move was just a castle, and now Magnus said that he was intending to play h4, which is certainly very interesting. Looks a little scary. CD, h5, g5, but the thing is, black is able to keep the file closed. So if you play h6, g6. You can even play h7, and now probably just king h8. Not to have to worry about the pawn going to h8 at any point. And it's a very messy position, but it doesn't look like black is doing badly. So you can play rook c1 or bishop f3, kind of like the game. But it's not. Yeah, it's just a mess of a position. And the king actually feels very safe on h8 for now, right? I mean, even for the future. So it's more a question of whether these pawns on e5 and d4 will hold or not. So but castling was the sort of natural way to play here. Um, and then if you don't like castling, well, then maybe c4 is a possibility as well, or even rook c8, which kind of keeps attention, maybe threatens to take on d4. So I think MVL here just played a little bit too fast. C takes d4, bishop f3, and now he's got a real problem to solve in this pin, and I think he underestimated it. So let's look at a few moves. But rook c8 is it basically transposes, because next move is rook c1, and now he's got to move the queen somewhere. So and he chose the wrong square, and the position that comes after that is sort of interesting. So he could have played queen b6 was probably the best move, the best try. And this still is a difficult position. I guess the most natural is queen c2, threatening to take on c6. But it turns out that this position is still kind of messy after castles. So this was definitely his best chance. I still think that white is better. You can just take on d4. And then I guess if you play knight takes d4, queen c8, that position is just going to be difficult. I think the queen is going to be outmatched here. But on pawn takes d4, yeah, but he can try some other moves here, and it's not. I think white with the two bishops and probably the safer king is to be preferred, but it's not clear. But he played on rook c1, queen d7. Now that was just a blunder, a tactical mistake. And after queen c2, he probably assumed that he had knight e7, which is what he played. He has to play. The threat was either bishop takes c6, but also queen takes c6, right? Because, so for example, you can't make a move like d3 because of queen takes c6, winning a piece. So he plays knight a7, and now a very nice tactic, queen takes c8. And it's simple, but the main point is not that it even wins material. It's that the endgame is really bad. So if he plays queen takes c8, he's not actually losing much material. Okay. White can play pawn takes d4, or we were also looking at bishop c6, which forces king f8. Seems to make sense. And then pawn takes d4. Either way, here it's a bad endgame for black, because these pawns are just weak. Sorry, I don't know how this arrow happened. We want to play bishop b7, and this is bad. I mean, it probably is close to lost. So MVL, after queen c2, knight a7, queen takes c8, he decides to just sacrifice the exchange, play knight takes c8, and then after bishop c6, try to defend this position with a blockade on d5. But here Magnus plays a very good move, h4. And so with that, he basically already breaks the sort of fortress that black seems to have. Of course, you can't take on h4 because of the pin. There's g3. Now, you could take on h4 with the rook, but here rook takes, bishop takes, rook h1, and the rook infiltrates here. And that exchange of a pair of pawns and of rooks is really important. Like once the rooks are gone, this one rook is kind of unopposed. If it gets to a8, for example, it will be really strong. It might go to g7 first. So now that rook is a little bit unopposed. So this would be winning. And actually, this is what happened. Bishop e7, rook h7, bishop f8, rook h8, king e7, king c2. And MVL resigned a little bit early here. F6 is a really bad move, but even if he does, we were looking at what does white do if he does nothing, like if he just plays, for example, king e8 and just starts sitting, and yeah, I mean it's we came up, I think, with a couple of different plans. The main problem is that he's going to run out of moves, right? Like at some point you play, let's say, I don't know, a3, king e8. We can play g4, king e7, g5, king e8, and then eventually he's going to run out of moves that he can do. So here now finally you can play bishop b4 and it's just over. So at some point he's got to here king e8, d5, and so he runs out. He's going to eventually lose his bishop. So basically a clean game from Magnus and sort of a bad game from MVL. And I don't know if it's the Slav that's causing him some issues or something else. But then the last game, MVL has to win. They get another Slav. So Magnus this time decides to play, I guess, MVL's opening of the day. And MVL's been playing d4 in this tournament, which is a little bit unusual for him. Magnus plays pawn takes c4. You can also play g6 as they were talking about first, but similar type of position. They actually get a Grunfeld style position. And now Magnus's preparation is impressive. This c5 move was played by Dubov, who was actually commentating today. He had a rapid game. I think it was a rapid game with this position. And this is a pretty impressive move to know and remember. It looks crazy, right? Because white can do a move like this, which of course here is met by by bishop e4. But it is sort of surprising. Even knight g5 is met, I believe, by knight a6, and it's an exchange sacrifice. And you argue that here this bishop is extremely important to white's position, and that you have good play here, and certainly you do. But this is impressive preparation, this c5 idea. So MVL plays knight c3, which is, I think, considered a good move. Knight c6, but here already he might be out of preparation, and he chose sort of a safe way to play, but not one that leads to any advantage for white. There's some complicated variations here, of course, but he plays knight h4. I kind of want to get to the rook ending that they get. So things get traded here, and unfortunately black is really, really active. So even though their pawn structure is a little messed up, white is basically forced to trade queens. You can't play knight to d4 because of rook d6, threatening the queen, and so on. And on e3 or bishop e3, you have e5. So he plays queen takes d4, a6, and then even though he's up a pawn, the position is, of course, is extremely active for black. And so I think a position like knight c3, probably knight e4. It's hard to imagine that white is going to be better here, with the rooks coming into the position. But that might be better than knight a3, which is what he played. And after knight a3, it's hard for him to move anything. Black plays knight e4. The knight can come to d2 in some cases. So, for example, on f3, knight d2. And the threat is going to be rook takes c1, or at least the simplifying threat, if it doesn't necessarily win material, is a problem. So after knight e4, king g2, rook c1, they get to a position with equal material. This one is not shouldn't have been as exciting as it got, but Magnus sort of outplays him here. I mean, MVL needed to win, of course, to tie the match, and so that might have played into the moves that he made, because some of the simplifications were clearly not going to help him. But already here he's misplayed a little bit, and his position is uncomfortable. Magnus finds the move knight e4, which essentially forces a transposition into a difficult rook endgame. He could have tried to hold. He was actually playing really fast MVL in this game. Zealand Zen is saying the knight on the rim, which was on a3 before, it was hard to get it off. Yeah, it's sort of typical to have this like pawn sacrifice to get that activity with a fianchettoed bishop, and it's very hard to develop. But yeah, so here MVL allows this simplification into a pawn down rook endgame, which should be a draw, but it's definitely tricky because Magnus is able to keep the pawn with rook h5, and then they get to another. So I think white had probably easier ways to make a draw, but it gets to a really fascinating position, which we're going to get to. Okay, so this position, king f3. So king f3 is actually a bad move, and it turns out that rook takes h5 was probably maybe the only way to make a draw here. But these endings, are incredibly tricky even at the highest level. And so here, if you play like rook a1, for example, there's rook c5, and you check in that direction. And the king, unfortunately, can't stay on a very good square. So if you play king to d4, then it's going to be hard to keep the white king from marching this way. If you play king to b4, well, again, I mean, unfortunately, the king is going to come. And so here you play like rook c8, for example, a4, and I think you can just bring the king. I have to be careful with how I make moves here because I can trap myself. But it looks like he should have taken that pawn. He goes king f3, which is a surprising choice because, I think most players would go, all right, I'm going to take the pawn. And here Magnus is actually winning, but it's very tricky. I think the most sort of instructive way, might have been to play h4. And so here, if he tries to do the same thing as in the game, it just doesn't quite work. And I'll show you why. The problem is he can't stop the pawn from coming to h3 very easily. And so in some cases, black will look to kind of use this pawn as a Trojan horse to sacrifice. So here he doesn't have checks on the e file, so you can actually start pushing, right? I think like either rook a1, or actually maybe rook a1 throws it away. Rook a2. Right, so rook a2, now you're threatening to go h3 to h2. So white kind of is tempted into going here. And now after a4, a3, you're able to get to a position that you can win. But let's look at the difference. So he goes king f3, rook a2. So Magnus plays rook a2, a mistake. Now already I think it's a draw. King g3 was a mistake. Apparently he has to check. Now this gets so difficult. But let's look at the game just so we sort of see where this is coming from. So a4 he plays. Now apparently black is winning. King d3 throws the win away, surprisingly. And so the right move here, and this is the one that I actually wrote down the variation, so it's worth seeing, is h4. So h4 wins. So there's two ways to take it. We'll look at also not taking it. But this is a fascinating sort of setup. So if you play, let's start with king takes h4, let's say. So now you can play a3. If you try to check, let's say we go king b4. So now we'd love to get our rook to like c2 and play a2, and that's going to win. So you keep checking. And then the difference is that you run out of checks. So you go here, king d3. And now, you've run out of checks. And when you go, let's say rook g4 to keep checking this way, well, then you can actually give this check. Any rook move actually wins, but rook e2, any rook move that doesn't hang the pawn is going to be winning. And then on rook g3, you can play rook e3, and then you bring the king to b3, play a2, and you're going to win. So that's if king takes h4. Next, we can look at rook h4. Rook h4 is, I think, even easier because now we just play a3. If the rook goes back to a4, let's say, we play king b3. The rook goes here. We can play rook c2. And then we'll play, or rook b2 maybe is more accurate. And then on this check, you can go this way and you'll play a2, and that will be winning. So that's on, where was I? That was on rook takes h4, right? I just looked at. So that leaves like a king move here, but essentially now the king is being pushed to a bad square. And so now you can win. I think this one maybe doesn't. It's tricky. How does this work? Even I get confused. I think maybe rook a1 is the right move. Or king. So rook a1. Now if we check, it's going to be again one of these it's one of these crazy king moves. King e4, now a3. And for some reason, I think you can't play straight a3 because now rook e3, and now you don't have a square to hide. So now we keep checking, and the checks are really annoying. You go back to e3. And so now the rook can't move that way. So you got to play rook a1, and then we get the position. This is the position that they end up getting in the game, I think. And amazingly, here you can't make progress. So a2, rook a3, you can't make progress here because as soon as the king, these positions are known. Like you have to have an f pawn to be able to win. Then you just push your f pawn until you distract the king. Once the king gets distracted, like force to the third rank, you have a check. So this one, it's really tricky in the game. So he goes king d3, and king d3 actually throws the win away. Rook f4, king e3, rook f3, king e4, rook f4. So he hides, but now he doesn't have a way. He doesn't have a way to bring his king back to the third rank without playing a3. And once he plays a3, rook b3, again, he doesn't have a way to get his king through all the checks that white is going to have without playing a2. And so it's just a draw. So kind of an amazing endgame. We could look at it a lot deeper. I'm not sure that I myself fully understand it. There's a lot of tricks. In fact, I think it's the kind of position a computer would win every single time and a human would lose every single time. It's really hard. But yeah, really worth seeing. Yeah, it is really tricky. If Magnus, doesn't figure it out, and Magnus is incredibly good at these sort of theoretical end games, it's definitely very difficult. So now we're going to look at the Alireza Fabiano match. The first game was very surprising. Alireza has white, and they play a Slav, so we're getting a lot of Slavs. And in fact, we're getting this d takes c4 position. And now Alireza plays e4, and this is a pretty dangerous gambit for black. And I think that's one of the reasons why some people prefer to play g6 instead of pawn takes c4, and you take on c4 at a different move, because this gambit is dangerous. Now, Alireza played it in a bit of an unusual. So bishop d3 is an old move. I think there was an old Bronstein, one of these grandmasters from a few generations ago. And I think in this position, the move that's the trickiest is bishop d2. And there was a game Dubov actually played, so we're getting to feature a lot of Dubov openings today. But this move is very tricky. The idea is simply to play bishop a5, right? So if you make normal moves, maybe bishop b7 is a more logical one. Bishop a5, queen c8. I think one game went knight to d2, knight d7, and then b4. And you get this kind of bind on the black position, right? If black can play c5 in these, it's going to be fine for him. But now he really can't. And so that bishop d2, bishop a5 with the idea to play b4 is really sneaky. And here white has a huge pawn center, and then you can develop with bishop d3 castles, maybe rook c1, maybe knight b3, maybe e5 sometimes. So you have a lot of different options. And this looks pretty interesting. I mean, not easy for black to play. So, but Alireza plays bishop d3, and that move is a little easier for black to meet, in my opinion. So Fabiano makes sort of normal moves. He's preparing to play hopefully c5 at some point. So rook c8. So now he's just about ready, I think, to do it if he's allowed. So Alireza plays e5, and this is a pretty interesting position still. Although I think, objectively, really black should be okay. It's the pawn up doesn't matter all that much. It doesn't at the same time, I guess. Knight b8, normal plan. He's trying to recycle the knight to a better square. The knight in d7 was pretty much dominated. So he's bringing it to c6, and from there it can go to either b4, either b4 or a5 sometimes. So Alireza plays b4, rook to c4. So that wasn't forced. I mean, against a move like b4, he has time now if he wants to maybe try to go here and knight c4. And a lot of people will be tempted by that. Now, the problem with it is that even though the knight on c4 is very nice, it might be a position where, once you get there, you don't actually have a lot of prospects. Like white, will probably just defend the b-pawn, move their queen away. And then, if you ever castle, you're going to be met with like g4, h4, g5. There'll be an attack. So Fabiano decides to do a very tempting offer, at least of an exchange sacrifice, where if you take it, this gets a beautiful bishop and you have a really nice pawn structure. This pawn is really weak. So in this case, this actually is probably just a bad position for white. But rook c4, pretty instructive move, I thought. So he plays, he declines the offer. He goes rook b1, knight d7. Knight c6 was interesting too, to try to force white to take, and I think he is kind of forced. And so we get this position. It's not as nice, of course, because the knight on c6, really you'd want to put the knight to d5, and now it's further away from there. But it still is an interesting position. I think the computer likes this move. And then I think taking with the queen doesn't work because of queen c2. You get trapped. So I think you have to play pawn takes. And then it's just a messy position. But I would be tempted to take black here, because at any point you might have a5, b4. It's not... I feel like black is doing pretty well. But Fabiano played knight d7, knight e1, knight b6, queen e2. So they're basically, nobody wants to take that rook. And here Fabiano, rook takes b4. He said in the postmortem that this was just a blunder. He missed bishop takes b5, and so so this was not a good move. He could have played either knight a4 or maybe queen c7. He probably still doesn't want to castle, because castling just looks really dangerous. But this was a blunder because he missed that this bishop b5 check is very strong. Now it's just a difficult position. Knight d7. Alireza made a mistake here. He really should have tried to play for the attack, just play bishop a4, And then, okay, black probably at some point has to castle. But then you play knight d3, knight f4, and even though black is up a pawn, this knight is going to get to h5, queen to g4, maybe bishop c2. I mean, you're going to have, you can play rook d3. You can have every single piece pointed at the king side. Pretty dangerous looking position. Instead, he goes knight d3, and then the position gets to be very symmetrical. And with just that one bishop, it's much harder to drum up an attack. But let me fast forward because these games have been very interesting, but I'm going too slowly. So they get to this position. Alireza was pretty short on time here, and yeah, this becomes a fascinating position. Fabiano plays bishop h5. So now there was a forced draw after rook c8, king h7, and it should be the fair result in this position if both players play perfectly. And this is pretty fascinating. So he made the move queen c2, which loses. And the draw was with bishop f6. So of course Alireza saw this idea. He just kind of executed it in the wrong order. So bishop f6. The threat is to play rook h8. Now if king takes h8, there's queen f8 takes g7. And if king g6, there's queen c2, and it's actually mate, right? So rook h8 is a mate threat. So really, there's only one move here for black that holds a draw. If you play pawn takes f6, by the way, queen f8, now you're threatening queen g8 mate, and there's not a good defense here. I think the only real move is queen c8, and of course, I'm not saying that it's completely winning for white, but of course, white is going to be trying. So after bishop f6, yeah, this is kind of amazing. The only draw is rook h1, king h1. Queen f1, king h2, and now bishop f3. And so this is a beautiful, beautiful position. Now it's almost mate, right? Like white almost has queen c2 because if g6, rook h8 is mate. But black has the resource bishop e4 here, and this actually turns the tables to a winning position for black. So queen c2 is not right. Of course, if white wants to make a draw, then they just take the bishop. Queen f2, and we just check, right? So yeah, this was an amazing position. And instead in the game, Alireza, very short on time, plays queen c2 check, bishop g6, queen c5, and now queen f1. And so now he's just too late. And so bishop e4 is coming, and he doesn't have time. And if he plays f3, there's rook b2. And this falls. So after this, it's just lost. He plays bishop f6. Maybe he thought that this was going to be winning. Unfortunately, Fabiano is one move too quick. Bishop e4. Now it's the same thing. f3 looks like it patches things up, and there's rook b2. And the problem is that in all these positions, you can play rook h8, but the king doesn't take. Queen f8 mate. But goes king g6, and there's not even a check here. So it's just losing. So yeah, so after bishop f6, I guess the game just ended here, actually, I think. Yeah, so yeah, really kind of too bad for Alireza because he played a pretty good game here. So then in the second game, Fabiano now is white, and this game didn't go well at all for Alireza. He played a Slav, so we're getting a lot of Slavs today. Similar variation to the one that Magnus played. In fact, could be almost the same. Now here, for some reason, Alireza played c takes d5. This has been played quite a bit, and I think e takes d5 has been played a lot. C takes d5 just doesn't look quite right. After rook c1, he's got sort of he's got real problems on the c file, and yeah, he just didn't get out of the opening alive here. Queen d8 is sort of the admission that it was a really bad move. So I'm not sure what he was intending here. I mean, queen b6 is probably a better move, but it's sort of a depressing admission. You're agreeing to play an endgame where white has the two bishops better developed. Yeah, it's just not. You probably just take here. Now pawn takes is an ugly pawn structure here, so he probably has to take with the knight. And then I don't know if knight b5 maybe. You could take on g6 first, maybe then knight b5, maybe bishop b5. I don't know. For sure it's going to be like a free bishop pair and better development. It's a better position for white, but playable. For some reason, he plays queen to d8, and now after thunder outside, by the way, in Florida today, after queen b7, he doesn't really have enough here. I don't know if he intended to play rook to b8, but if he plays rook b8, queen a6, rook b2, there's knight a4, and this is again a really bad position. The main problem is that on rook a2 you have actually you have rook c8 here, and if you play rook to b8, that's when there's bishop a5, and yeah, so just a bad position. So yeah, I mean, he just lost a pawn, and the rest of the game, I mean, I'll go through quickly because it's not that interesting. He tried to drum up some counterplay, but it was never really in doubt. Fabiano managed to win an exchange, and then the game. So a smooth game for Fabiano. Now the next game, Alireza, has to win because he's trailing 2-0, and it was sort of a crazy game where the opening. So Fabiano just misplayed the opening here. I think there is some theory with this. I don't actually know the theory in this position, but I know that everyone was very critical of the position he got here. This position after e5, knight d5 is just a really ugly position. I mean, it looks like it could be almost lost. So something went wrong here, and yeah, I mean, it's just a sort of a theoretical thing. But here, white has all the pieces already aimed at the king side. Black is not very well developed, and even though there's no instant weakness, I mean, it's impossible not to create a weakness because yeah, I mean, the threats are very quick. So he plays h6, queen e2. The threat is already queen e4, and it's difficult to parry. He plays knight d7. Now, I actually think queen e4, which is super tempting because it forces black to have this ugly pawn structure. I think that was a mistake. Because black really doesn't have any useful moves coming, right? Like b6 is met by knight a6, by knight c6. So I wonder why he couldn't play this. And then, if he plays f5, you get the same pawn structure, but you're actually, winning the e6 pawn. So he can't play f5. So he would have to make a move like rook e8, but a move like rook e8 makes the position worse. So I think he could have considered doing that. This starts to get really, really scary very quickly for black. So, but he plays queen e4. I mean, it's, of course, white can only be better in this position, but things kind of went wrong for Alireza here. And we'll go fast forward a little bit here to a position where, like, Fabiano was essentially equalized, but Alireza managed to play well, keep some chances on the board, and this was sort of an end game that went both ways. At some point here, black was better, and then somehow he was worse. So, and eventually blundered. But so it kind of went both ways. They both had no time. Obviously, Alireza had to try to win. And here Fabiano just blundered the bishop in a position that was already losing, though. So even if he didn't blunder the bishop, he would probably lose here. All of his pawns are falling. So I could have, of course, gone in a lot more detail, but I'm running out of time for this after show to last just about an hour. And so going back to the next game now, it's 2-1, and so Alireza has a theoretical and a real chance. So he's black, but he plays the King's Indian, which is always a good attempt at trying to mix things up and win. Fabiano decides to play G3, which I think is not his main system. He often plays like the lines with I think he plays like some H3 lines and some more mainline stuff. I don't know if G3 is what he plays too often. And Alireza makes this move knight e4, which he had made against Peter Svidler. So it was great to have Peter Svidler here to explain this, which is a bit of an odd move, but essentially he's trying to exchange this knight for this other knight, and then say that he gets a decent Dutch where he's going to play f5 and e5. And it's interesting. I saw a lot of games when I looked it up afterwards. And nothing that's too obvious. It looks like white should be ahead in development and be able to do something concrete. But the most concrete plans sort of involve playing here knight c3, knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and then try to play e4. But black seems to have a fighting chance in all the lines, so it's an interesting setup. Um, so he plays e5 here, and already he gets a very active position. Superficially, white seems to be in a nice spot here with like an advantage in development, but structurally, black is quite okay. They have a knight that can jump to d4. It's not an easy position for white to play. So he plays knight e1, which is a very logical move. Queen e7. He gets out of the pin. At some point, might want to play e4. And this is it's a strategically risky position for white. Like black wants to play knight d4, maybe c6, bishop e6. And you can just be better for black if white's not careful. And in the game, Fabiano sort of made a mistake here. Maybe the move knight d3 made sense. They talked about that a little bit in the post-mortem. But he made the move knight f3, which is logical, but I think he missed the response here. After knight b4, queen b3, knight a6, so a strong move. And now the problem is that his bishop is in danger of getting trapped, and that's why knight d3. So knight d3 would have prevented that. And so in this position, it's not easy for him to play. He played knight e1, then e4, basically trying to circle the bishop up. But g7, queen g7. And white is basically forced to sacrifice a pawn to save that bishop, right? There's nothing else. So he plays c5. Then after c6, bishop c4, knight c5. Maybe white has some compensation, but certainly this is not a position that Fabiano wanted to get, when he just has to make a draw with white to win the match. So kudos to Alireza for this. But Fabiano is very tenacious. You'll notice that in his games. And he fights to the bitter end. It looks like Alireza played very well up to here. Bishop a6 was a very strong move, so he doesn't trade queens right away, but puts pressure on e2. Rook e1, queen takes, rook d8. All of this was very, very logical. But maybe bishop c8 was an inaccuracy, and suddenly Fabiano managed to find a good way to fight. It's possible that rook f8 would have been a better move, trying to get the rook off of this square, rook to e6. And then maybe just rook to e8 and trying to trade the rooks that way. Although it's still, it still is a game. This looks better than what he got, and we'll see why. So after bishop c8, which was a very natural move, Fabiano trades a pair of rooks, and suddenly after rook d1, bishop d1, it looks like, okay, well, the bishop is in a worse square. How bad can it be? But it's surprisingly difficult to make progress because this knight and rook just prevent the king from coming out. And it's hard for either the king or the rook to come out of where they are. So Alireza plays rook d8, bishop b3. Now, in some cases, the threat is to play bishop e6. As Magnus pointed out, bishop e6 not a threat right away because of knight g4. But c5. Now, Fabiano finds a nice move, bishop d5, to keep the pressure on. And now he had a plan that I didn't notice at all when I was looking at this game, but his plan seems to be to play f4 to try to dislodge the knight. And it's a very strong plan because the knight stops white from trying to play rook f7, knight f6, sort of a typical mating schema. But that's his plan. He played this part extremely well to make it hard. So bishop d7 was already a mistake. Potentially the move would have been a6 to play b5. You can't take on b6 because the bishop will hang then. And now f4, but it still is not. It still looks like white is holding. So, something went wrong for Alireza earlier, but really solid defense. And now he wants to play f4. So we were looking, I think, at this position with Fabiano after the game. And it's not, it doesn't look like black is better here because there's just not a lot of material. And I don't know how he's going to make progress with that king on h8 being so weak. So yeah, I mean, in the game, he unfortunately just kind of collapsed after bishop d7, f4, pawn takes. Well, pawn takes here was just a blunder. He should have played pawn takes f3, pawn takes f3, and then maybe f4 or something like that because he's really got to stop the pawn from coming to f4. But unfortunately, Alireza played gf4, gf4, knight g4, rook d6, and now he's got a pin that's lethal. So sort of a sad end for Alireza's comeback here. So he's been so close in a bunch of matches and just has come up a tiny bit short. There's a question here in the audience: how have players handled the time, and have any been flagged without disconnection? No flags. With a 10-second increment, a flag is pretty unlikely. It's really a lot of time for those guys to kind of make a few moves, get back to 30 seconds. They could blunder, and there have been certainly big blunders, but not any flags. But players have handled the time a little bit differently. Like Nepomniachtchi in particular has played incredibly fast. Like he tends to have 8 to 10 minutes like deep into the game. So he's really playing it almost like a much quicker game. And then other guys like Alireza actually has played fairly slowly and sometimes been, left to just 30 seconds or less for pretty complicated positions. Fabiano sort of in the middle, but I think in general, all of those guys approach this time control as the time control where you don't want to fall behind too much. And because some players play fast, it kind of makes everybody else play fast too, because they don't want to fall behind. So it's interesting, but the time management strategy for this time control is pretty tricky because it's an in between. So you could sit and take 2-3 minutes at a really key moment, of the game, but some players like Nepomniachtchi just seem to like making good enough decisions and making their opponents feel the pressure of the moves coming back to you really fast. So different strategies, and Nepomniachtchi has been fairly successful so far. So I'm going to go back to my other screen here, show you the standings again. These are, of course, partial standings. The ones in gray are players who have not played who are playing tomorrow, and so they have a chance to improve their score. But Magnus is going to be in first place so far, regardless of what happens in the next round, because he, even if Hikaru were to win, he'll be at 10 points. And so Magnus still in the lead after the fourth round. And yeah, so he can't be caught just yet. But it's still a wide open race as to who will finish in the top four. Magnus presumably in a good position to finish in the top four, but certainly wide open for the others. So we'll see if tomorrow Anish Giri gets there and still has a chance, because I think for Alireza now it's going to be tough with just three matches. The most he could get is 9 points if he won every match outright, which probably won't be enough. But we saw some great chess, and I was really happy to see this kind of crazy rook end game. We don't get a lot of these to look at, but sort of a fascinating position with the lateral checks. And I hoped you enjoyed the after show, and I will see you all tomorrow. We are going to have a fun event with Anna Rudolph. If you guys don't know her, you can actually, premium members, by all means, check out her video series on Chess24. If you're not a premium member, then please know that the video series are kind of an amazing value. I mean, you can get things from videos from Magnus himself to Jan Gustafsson to Laurent Fressinet to Peter Svidler, Vishy Anand, number of people, and I maybe don't talk about it enough. And yeah, so that's it for me today. I will see you all tomorrow. Thanks so much for tuning in. And I will play a couple of words from one of our sister companies. And I will, see you then. Bye.